and labor markets and understand that this is going to be the first half of Chapter 10. We'll go over the second half tomorrow. But a labor market basically is like any other market where, again, goods and services are bought and sold. In this case, it's your labor, right? Labor is working for somebody else for a wage. And understand that wages are determined by supply and demand. Okay? And the one thing we know is that the more skills you have, the higher your wage is going to be. How is it determined how much you get paid? Well, a big part of that is the supply and demand for your labor. That's why doctors get paid really, really well, is there's a very small supply of doctors. There's only, less than 1% of the population has a degree that allows them to be a doctor. Matter of fact, there's such a small supply of doctors that now we have nurse practitioners who are not doctors, but they're nurses, but have advanced training that allow them to essentially treat you as if they were doctors. So you have those to kind of mitigate the very small supply of doctors we have. But that's why doctors get paid very, very well, right? And why does a McDonald's worker get paid minimum wage? Well, it's because the supply of people who could work at McDonald's is pretty much everybody. Anybody who essentially can stand for 4 to 8 hours a day and be minimally trained can work at McDonald's, right? If you show just a minimal amount of effort and you can stand on your feet for 4 to 8 hours at a time, you can work at McDonald's. So the supply of potential workers at McDonald's is very, very large. It's basically every adult who's capable of standing for 4 hours, which is most of the population. It's not all, but it's most. And the demand, quite honestly, is fairly low compared to that supply. So essentially, your wages are determined by supply and demand, and what kind of determines the supply is the skills that each person has. Do you have the skills to match the job? And jobs that require more skills or more education, you're going to have fewer people you're competing with. Essentially, there is going to be a smaller supply of labor, and as a result, that'll drive up the price. So wages are determined by supply and demand. And essentially, your wage is also based on what we call the marginal revenue product. Essentially, the idea is that how much extra money do you bring in to your employer? We'll kind of discuss marginal revenue product a little more in depth here in a moment, but it's how much extra money your firm earns from selling your output to consumers. So, for example, let's say we run a computer company, okay? We sell 5 computer chips for one worker here. So, we sell computer chips for $70. So one worker produces 5 computer chips at $70 each. So this worker's marginal revenue product is $350, right? So because they produce 5 computer chips at $70 each. So they help us make $350. The second worker, okay, now with the second worker, we make 9. Okay, here, we make 9 computer chips. So how many extra computer chips does the second worker produce for us? Okay, we go from 5 to 9. So this person adds 4, right? Okay, 4 times 70 is $280. So this person's marginal revenue product is $280. So as long as we are, as long as we can pay somebody $280 or less, we'll hire 2 workers. Okay, The third worker, we produce 12. So this person adds 3, again, times 70. Marginal revenue product is 210. So, if we're able to hire workers at $210 each, we will hire 3 workers. If we have to pay $280, we'll only hire 2, because this person would cost us more than that person brings in. Okay, so marginal revenue product is a fairly simple concept. You basically take the marginal product times the price, and you figure out how much extra revenue that person brings in. Okay, so people are paid based on their marginal revenue product, and I think that's a really important thing to understand. That no business is going to pay somebody more money than the additional income that person brings in, the additional revenue it brings in. So from that, understanding the marginal revenue product, we can derive the demand curve for labor. Okay. And in the demand curve for labor, it is just like the regular demand curve, where, at a price of, say, $350, we will hire 1 worker. At a price of $280, we'll hire 2 workers. Okay, at a price of $210, we'll hire 3. And then at a price, say, of $140, okay, if we kept this going here, we'd hire 4 workers. Price of $70, we'd hire 5. And any price less than $70, we'd hire, we could hire 6. But so essentially, an individual firm's demand curve for labor is going to stair step, okay? Because at each level, you can hire 1 more person as the price goes down, okay? As the price of labor goes down, or the wage rate goes down, each firm can hire 1 more person. Now, if you take this over a full industry, then the demand curve, like anything else, slopes downward. We can smooth that out, and it slopes downward. So essentially, we will hire the number of workers where the wage rate is at or below the marginal revenue product. In other words, that the amount of money they bring in, as long as the amount of money they bring in is greater than their wage, we'll hire that number of workers. So the demand for labor is derived not necessarily based on what we think is the value to society or perceived value or anything like that. The demand curve for labor, and thus the demand for labor in an industry, is based on one thing: how much consumers are willing to pay for that good or service at each possible price. What is the demand for that good or service? And thus, how much people are willing to pay, the market price of the good, then determines how much people are willing to, how much firms have available to hire workers. And so the demand curve is based on the willingness of consumers to pay for goods and services. Consumers ultimately determine how much of anything gets produced by what you buy. So the supply curve for labor is going to be similar to a normal supply curve. As wages increase, as the wage rate increases, the quantity supplied increases, right? So, and then from that, you can find, the demand curve for a good, the demand curve for labor is based on how much we can sell a good for, how much of a good we can sell at each possible price. And the supply curve for labor is just simply how many people are willing to apply for a job at each possible price. And as the price goes up, more people are willing to apply for jobs. And, that was something that we demonstrated a few weeks ago. I think the last time we were virtual, when I asked you, hey, we're hiring for a Burger King. How many of you are going to apply at this price? How many of you are going to apply at this price? And so forth and so on. So what ends up happening then is that higher skilled workers are in smaller supply. So that pushes the supply curve to the left. And as a result, the price of labor goes up. Okay, so the price of labor goes up, and just like anything else, every firm has an equilibrium wage rate where there's this intersection of supply and demand, and we kind of have a pretty good idea of what people will be paid based on their skills and experience. And it's pretty common and pretty standard throughout an industry in a given region. For example, the salary for teachers in Indiana, there are some districts that pay more and there are some districts that pay less because we do compete with each other for teachers. But for the most part, they're pretty consistently across the board, pretty much the same. One may pay $3,000 or $4,000 a year more, one may pay $3,000 or $4,000 a year less for somebody with comparable skills and experience. But for the most part, our pay rates are pretty much the same across the board. So the equilibrium wage rate then just is simply the intersection of supply and demand, and that can generally be pretty consistent for an industry. So we can look up essentially, how much people get paid in an industry pretty easily and figure out, okay, what is the basic equilibrium wage rate? And the one thing you'll notice is that as skills go up, the pay also goes up. As the education required to do a job goes up, the pay will also go up. Okay. Now, one thing that kind of throws a little bit of a wrench into the market for labor is the existence of labor unions. Okay. And labor unions are associations of workers who work together to collectively bargain for wages and working conditions for everybody. And so one thing that a labor union will do is that instead of, for example, and we're a unionized business, teachers are unionized, as are a lot of public employees, government employees. The one thing that we can do is I cannot go into Mr. Volz's office and say, look, I need more money. I need this kind of break. I need that kind of break. I need this specific condition for me. I can't do that. And, there have been a couple of things I have asked for, and the response is always the same. You got to go through the union. That is something that is bargained through the union. We cannot do anything special for you. We cannot do anything different for you. You have to do that through the union. Okay, so basically what the union does is that instead of me negotiating my salary and my hours and what classes I teach and whatever through individually with Mr. Volz or our superintendent, I do that. That is done collectively by the union on our behalf. So the union negotiates the pay, the working conditions, the benefits, all of that for all of the teachers in the district. And we essentially then all get treated largely the same. So one thing that, there's a strength in numbers in a union because, for example, if, again, I went into the boss's office and said, hey, look, give me more money or I'm walking off the job, the answer will probably be, okay, you've got two options. Go back to your job and be happy with the money you get. And then, if it's time for a raise, we'll talk. Or there's the door. Don't let it hit you on the way out. Right. So, one person can easily be replaced as long as their skills are not so unique. There are some people that cannot easily be replaced. But the long term, though, if all of us, like all the workers in an industry, say in a factory, just decided to go into the boss and say, give us more money or we're walking. Well, now the boss has got to think, hey, look, I can't produce with no workers, right? And so as a result, there's kind of some strength in numbers with the union that kind of allows the workers to be protected. So a little bit more, and thus usually drives up wages. Unions could drive up wages through a couple of ways. One of them is concept of feather bedding, where a union contract can kind of require a firm to hire more workers than it needed, or impose work rules that may reduce output per worker. Then that will increase the demand for labor. And by increasing the demand, that'll drive up the price. And so, for example, Kroger is a union shop, and people get paid differently based on their job. And so the cashiers get paid more than the stock people. Well, if they're running really slow and one of the stock people has to come up and run a register, every single member of the stock crew, every single stocker that is on the clock that hour gets paid the cashier's pay, because a stocker had to be called up to be a cashier. Everybody's going to get paid that amount. So, and so as a result, you want to make sure you have maybe more cashiers than you need so that you don't have to invoke that rule. So another thing they can do is increase demand by lobbying against imports or lobbying against competition. Unions can also decrease the supply of labor by restricting access to apprenticeships. One thing you need, especially this goes for what we call skilled labor jobs, things like being a plumber or an electrician or things like that. You don't necessarily need to go to college for those jobs, but you do need some post-high school education. And one way that happens is through apprenticeships, where you will maybe be an apprentice plumber and you will work alongside and watch a plumber do his or her job for a few months or a few years, and you'll get training on how to be a plumber. And eventually you'll be good enough to be a plumber yourself. But a lot of times those are run through the plumbers union. And so they only accept a certain number of apprentices each year. And so what that does is it will limit the supply. And by limiting the supply of something, again, that drives up the price. And then, because unions have monopoly bargaining power to negotiate, that monopoly is usually in the seller's benefit. And remember, when you are going to work, you are the seller. So what that'll do is it'll push the wage up above equilibrium. Right now, about 1 in 8 American workers are in a labor union. So their influence has been kind of declining a little bit. So one other thing, and it's not in the PowerPoint notes, and because it's not really in the book, but I feel like it's important. So I'm going to touch on this really, really quick, and then we're going to wrap up. And that is the different categories of labor. I think, this is a college textbook, so I think it assumes that you have already studied these things in a high school class. And this is your high school class, but it's also your college class, right? So the different categories of labor basically are the, kind of where the supply and demand meet here. Unskilled labor, okay? Unskilled labor, and I'm going to take the presentation off so that we can see a little bit more easily here. So unskilled labor is where there is no prior training that is needed. Basically, anybody can walk off the street and be hired for a job. So in unskilled labor, there's no prior training needed. They usually pay very low because essentially anybody can work these jobs, okay? So, your supply curve is here, your demand curve is here, so your price of labor is very, very low. So think of, jobs like McDonald's, as unskilled labor. Semi-skilled labor, custodial jobs kind of fit into that. You may need some minimal training, but still, again, just about anybody can work in those jobs, okay? So skilled labor is jobs that require a little bit more training and skills, and somebody who can do complex tasks with little supervision. Somebody like a plumber, an electrician, and A plumber, an electrician, somebody like that is skilled labor. So, and as a result, they're paid a lot more because they have to have specialized skills. So their supply curve is more to the left, and as a result, their wage rates is much higher. Okay, and the final is professional labor. Okay, professional labor are people like doctors, nurses. Well, nurses I think fit into skilled labor, but doctors, lawyers, teachers, managers in business, CEO. This is basically the highest level of knowledge-based jobs, okay? So this is the highest level of knowledge-based jobs. Generally, these require a degree and sometimes a postgraduate degree like a master's or a doctorate degree. And because of this, because they require specialized skills and they often require some degree of management experience as well, the supply is really, really low and the demand is often really high. And so as a result, the wage rate is usually really, really high as well. And so, so the demand curve for, say, a doctor is going to be pretty high, but the supply curve of doctors is going to be, really far to the left. And so as a result of that, you have such a small supply and such a high demand that the price is really, really high. So that's essentially the way things work as far as the three categories of labor. And as you move up, as you develop more skills, you will be able to make more money. And that's really what it comes down to. You get paid based on your skills and the value to your employer, and that value is derived through the marginal revenue product that you create.